Basically, it's status quo. What was always regulated is going to be continue to be regulated just under village ordinances. So maybe the easy one first, the floodplain ordinance that we're talking about amending tonight. Again, this was adopted in February. There's a couple of amendments being proposed. One, there was a couple of flood insurance rate map panels that were inadvertently left out. So those are the 100-year floodplain maps that FEMA and the Army Corps produce that show where the actual floodplain is. So those two numbers are being added into the flood panels that apply to the ordinance. And then we have updated the standards for structures in the floodway. So the old language that was in our adopted version was old and wasn't part of the new model ordinance from the DNR. So the current language for structures in the floodway is now replacing the old language. And I've mentioned this before. We're not doing this tonight, but we're going to have to update this again at some point in the next few months when the new flood insurance rate maps are officially released for the new studies for the Fox River. So the floodplain has changed a little bit where it surrounds the Fox River. In most cases, I think it's shrunk a little bit, but it has changed. And so that'll be something upcoming. So essentially, that's what we're talking about changing tonight for the floodplain ordinance. For the shoreline ordinance, we're talking about adopting a number of things. Shoreline it comes in a couple different parts. The first part is the shoreline wetland regulations, and this is basically how all wetlands, DNR mapped wetlands, are regulated within the 300 feet of rivers and streams and 1,000 feet of lakes and ponds. And that's all it has to do with is what you can and can't do with those wetlands. That isn't changing. It's the same as it's always been for the county. Now it's our own ordinance. That's going to be a standalone ordinance in our code of ordinance. So it's outside our zoning ordinance, but it's something standalone, just like the floodplain ordinance is a standalone ordinance. And that's how the DNR prefers it. So that's one part. The other part is the shoreline overlay district, which is something different. It still applies to the same 300-foot, 1,000-foot buffers from rivers, lakes, and streams. But with that's an overlay district inside our zoning ordinance, just like our environmental corridor overlay district, our high groundwater overlay district. And essentially what that regulates are setbacks from the water's edge, the ordinary high water mark. So structures need to be set back at least 75 feet from the ordinary high water mark, which is the same as what it was under the county. There's some exceptions in there that we've talked about and we've discussed over the last few months for certain inobtrusive structures, for houses where there's properties on both sides of it that would happen to be closer to the water's edge than 75 feet. They could average the difference there. The other thing that's in there are vegetative buffer standards. And those basically have to do with the 35 feet of distance between the water's edge outward in terms of maintaining certain vegetative buffers. And so that's not required for villages to do or cities to do, but that's something that we chose to do over the last couple of months as we've been talking about this. So that's essentially what it is. It's very, very close to what the county has always implemented. Our standards for vegetative buffers are a lot simpler than the county has. Our exceptions for structures is very similar, though the county allows averaging for the shoreline based on only one house being next door. We've used the approach, and this came up last time we talked about this, that we're requiring both houses or houses on both sides to average. We don't have a lot of properties, a lot of houses, a lot of structures within 75 feet or very close to 75 feet of the water's edge. We're not a lake community. We obviously have the Fox River that comes through and some of the tributaries, but a lot of that is not usable land because of wetlands and floodplains and other things. So it's a lot less of an issue for us than it is for some communities with shoreline. The other thing we'd be changing, there's a couple of definitions that are going to be added to the zoning ordinance itself that has to do with shoreline, and that's just the definition of shoreline, and that's the 300,000 feet that we discussed, and then the shoreline setback area, which is the 75 feet that I mentioned. The final piece of the puzzle is the map. We have a new zoning map that it's right there. Yep, and right straight ahead of me is the new zoning map. Previously, the zoning map had a bunch of white bubbles and areas, and that's the old zoning map behind Lorene that's got a lot more white on it. And that's because those are the 300-foot, 1,000-foot areas that were previously under the county's jurisdiction are now under our jurisdiction, so you see all the colors. The zoning basically remains the same as it was before. The county had the same districts, use the same zoning districts as we do, but there are a few parcels, there's 8 parcels in total where the zoning is slightly changing, where in most cases it was 95% zoned under the village zoning district, but there was slivers of land that were zoned something different under the county's jurisdiction, and those have been changed for conformity so that now it's only one zoning district. But in no case does it substantially change any parcel or what you can do with any parcel. It's, again, just slivers around the shoreline areas that got changed. And then there were a couple parcels that are owned by Waukesha County that had split zoning on them between the village, where the village had a residential and ag zoning, and the county had a park or a public zoning, P1. And so the county has asked us, because they own those properties and they're going to be used for preservation and conservation and county park systems, that they be zoned to P1. So that's what we did. So very, very minor changes to. So that's okay. So that's essentially what the new map is. It's showing those buffers. It's showing our districts below, which aren't changing from the old county districts, except to clean up some of those slivers in the county-owned land. And so as an overview, that's all I have. And I'm happy